Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my continuation of my book reading of Misery. I'm at chapter 18 called Happy Birthday. Some weeks later, on the first day of summer, the old typewriter lost its keys as well. Paul thought, I am going to complain. I am not just going to ask for a new typewriter. I am going to demand one. I know she can afford it. Of course, he would ask Annie for nothing and certainly would not demand. Once there had been a man who would at least have asked. That man had been in much more pain, but he would have asked. He had been that man, and he supposed he ought to be ashamed, but that man had two big advantages over this one. That man had 2 feet and 2 thumbs. Paul sat quietly for a moment, staring at the typewriter, and then simply continued to type. It was better that way. Better not to ask. Better not to protest. Annie had become too strange. He had known for a long time that she was capable of doing. But these days, he couldn't have guessed what would make her do it. So he continued to work, but after 5 or 6 pages, the typewriter lost the letter E, the most common letter in English language. Paul could hardly believe it. What shall I do now? He thought. But of course, the answer was obvious. He would write by hand. But not now. The hole in the paper, the hole through which Misery and Ian and Jeffrey lived, had closed with a crash. He listened to the sounds of the lawnmower outside. Annie had a lawnmower which was like a small tractor. As soon as he thought of Annie, he remembered the axe rising and falling. Her calm face splashed with his blood. He remembered every word she had spoken, every word he had screamed, every sound and movement. Why couldn't he forget? You're supposed to forget, aren't you? People who have car crashes forget what happened and are surprised when they wake up in hospital. So why couldn't he forget? Because writers remember everything, Paul, especially the things that hurt. If you point to a writer's scars, he will tell you the story of every small one, from the big ones to get novels. Perhaps memories would heal him. But why should he bother to remember? He had done it, and all the time between then and now had been painful and boring. Except when he had to work on a silly book in order to escape feeling pain and being bored. There was no point in remembering, no point in anything, but there was. The point was misery, because misery kept him alive. As long as he was writing the book, Annie would let him live. But he wasn't writing the book for Annie. He wasn't writing the book to please Annie, but to escape from her. And then he realized that as long as he was writing the book, he let himself live too. He could have died that day, the day of the axe, but he didn't. And he didn't because he wanted to finish the book. It wasn't just Annie. He wanted to know what happened too. He was a writer, and writers remember everything, so he let himself remember. This time, the cloud had been darker, thicker, smoother. There was a feeling not of floating, but of sinking. Sometimes thoughts came, and sometimes dimly he heard Annie's voice. She sounded afraid. Drink this, Paul. You've got to. You've got to. How close had he come to sinking on the day of the axe? He didn't know. But he felt almost no pain during the week after the operation. It seemed to show that he was close to death. So did the fear in Andy's voice. He had lain there, hardly breathing, and what brought him out of it, out of the cloud, was misery. The book was unfinished. Paul didn't know what the ending was going to be, and he didn't know how some of the details fitted together. He never knew everything about the novels he wrote. He always waited to find out as eagerly as any reader. Excuse me. And this meant that there was unfinished questions in his mind. Those questions worried him, and so he came out of the cloud to find out what would happen to Misery. He chose to live. She didn't want him return to work. Not at first. He could see in her eyes that she had been frightened and was still uncertain. She had come closer to killing him than she had intended. She was taking extraordinary care of him, changing the bandages on his stump every night, every 8 hours, washing him down. While he was unconscious, she also filled in all the ends in the typescript. It was as if she was saying to him, "You can't think that I'm cruel to you, Paul, when I look after you so well and even write all those ends." He was finally able to persuade her that returning to work would help him, not harm him. And she too wanted urgently to know what was going to happen in the book. This was the one thing the two of them in that house shared, this crazy interest in Misery's adventures. He had always known he could write good books like Fast Cars, and that the Misery books were just a way of making money. But why had he written so many Misery books? He had plenty of money. It was as he almost hated to admit it to himself, because they gave him something his other books did not. The Misery books gave him the excitement of needing to know what would happen in the adventure. He shared this with his millions of readers, who eagerly turned the pages. He shared this with Annie. It was crazy. He was going to die anyway. He was going to kill him, but he still had to write it. It was more than just a way of escaping the cruel reality of his situation. He had to find out how the story would end. And it was the best Misery novel he had ever written, just as Andy had said it would be. At first, sitting and typing were extremely painful, and he could work only for short periods of time. The pain in his stump would burst into flame, and it would flash through his body. But gradually he was able to work more, and he was right. He did regain some strength. He would never be the man he had been in the past, but he did recover some health. One day Annie had come in with some ice cream. Although he didn't like it, he forced himself to eat it for fear of angering her. There was something about her that day which worried him. It was as if she was pretending to be cheerful, and then she came out with it, the reason for the gift of the ice cream. She put her spoon down, wiped her chin with the back of her hand, and said pleasantly, "Tell me the rest." Paul put his own spoon down. "I beg your pardon? Tell me the rest of the story. I can't wait." He ought to have guessed that this would happen. "I can't do that," he said. Her face had darkened immediately. "Why not?" "Because I'm a bad storyteller." She ate the rest of her ice cream in 5 huge mouthfuls. Paul's teeth ached from just watching her. Then she put her dish down and looked at him angrily. Not as if he was a great Paul Sheldon, her hero, but as if he was someone who had dared to criticize the great Paul Sheldon. "If you're a bad storyteller, how have you written so many books? Books which have sold millions and millions of copies." "I didn't say I was a bad story writer. I think I'm good at it, in fact, but I'm a useless storyteller." You're just making up stupid excuse. Our hands were closed into fists, tied against the side of her skirt. He found that he really didn't care that she was angry. He was frightened of being hurt again. But part of him didn't care what happened. It's not an excuse, he said. The two things are quite different. People who tell stories usually can't write stories. If you think writers are any good of talking, you ought to watch some poor fool of a novelist being interviewed at TV. Apart from that, I never quite know how the ending of one of my stories is going to be. I only really know when I've written it. Well, I don't want to wait, she said like a spoiled child. I bought you some nice ice cream, and at least you could tell me a few things. Alright. You don't need to tell me the whole story, but... Annie fired some questions at Paul about the book, but Paul shook his head to show that he wouldn't tell. She became even blacker, but her voice was soft. You're making me very angry. You know that, don't you, Paul? Of course I know it, but I can't help it. I could make you tell, she said, but she knew she couldn't. She could hurt him so that he said a lot of things, but she couldn't make him tell a story whose ending he didn't know. The blackness was beginning to disappear from her face. She was fighting an impossible fight. Annie, I'm not being selfish. I'm not telling you because I really want you to like the story. If I try to tell you, it'll come out wrong, and then you won't like it, and you won't want the book anymore. And then what will happen to me? But does Hezekiah really know about Misery's father? You could at least tell me that. Do you want a novel or do you want a bedtime story? He asked. Don't you dare to be so sarcastic with me, she shouted. Then don't pretend that you don't understand what I'm saying, he shouted back. She pulled back from him in surprise, and the last of the blackness disappeared from her face. He had skated on thin ice that time. He had expected her to get angry or depressed, but instead, he had returned to the old routine. Paul wrote and Andy read where he wrote each day and filled in the missing letters. But in fact, he had made her angry. Her anger stayed just below the surface, however, so he was never aware of it, at least not until a week later, when he had complained about the typewriter, about the missing ends. Well, if it bothers you so much, I'll have to give you something to stop you thinking about that stupid end, Annie said. She left the room, and he heard her in the kitchen, looking for something in the drawers. She was cursing in her particular way about stupid this and dirty that. 10 minutes later, she came in with a syringe, the bottle of dark liquid, and an electric knife. Paul immediately began to scream. Annie tested the knife, and Paul again begged and promised to be good. He twisted and turned in his wheelchair. Stay still, she ordered, or I'll use this knife on your throat. He stayed still while she poured the liquid on his thumb and on the blade of the knife. She switched the knife on and bent over him, concentrating on her work. As the blade hit into the flesh between his thumb and finger, she told him, in a voice which suggested that this was going to hurt her more than it was going to hurt him, that she loved him. She had cut his thumb off in the morning, and then that night she had buried it in his room, carrying a cake. No, let me read that again. She had cut his thumb off in the morning, and then that night she had hurried into his room, carrying a cake and singing happy birthday to him. It wasn't his birthday. There were candles all over the cake in no order. There, in the exact center of the cake, like an extra big candle, had been his thumb, his now gray thumb, with a nail a little rough, because he sometimes chewed it when he was thinking. If you promise to be good, she had told him, you can have a piece of cake, but you won't have to eat any of the special candle. So he had promised to be good, and so he wasn't going to complain that the typewriter had lost its keys and its ease as well. Paul was nearly asleep, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, listening to the steady sound of the lawnmower engine, and remembering. He jumped and wondered what had woken him up. At first, he didn't believe what he saw out of the window coming into Annie's farm. He thought he must be really asleep, but it was a police car. And that was the ending of chapter 18. Happy birthday. Next chapter, chapter 19, will be called Another Visitor. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.